When Jeffrey Epstein died in a federal detention cell on August 10, 2019, the media coverage focused almost exclusively on the most sensational aspects of his case: the private island, the powerful associates, the conspiracy theories surrounding his death. What went largely unexamined was a far more disturbing question, one with profound implications for the American financial system. How does a convicted sex offender, a man with no verifiable credentials in finance, maintain banking relationships with the most prestigious institutions in the world for more than a decade after his criminal conviction? This is not a documentary about Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. Those have been extensively documented elsewhere. This is an investigation into what his case reveals about the infrastructure of elite capitalism, the mechanisms by which sufficient wealth can purchase immunity from accountability, and the economic cost of discovering that the institutions we trust to safeguard our financial system have been compromised at the highest levels. The story that follows is built entirely on documented evidence, court filings, banking records, congressional investigations, and corporate disclosures. There are no conspiracy theories here, only the uncomfortable recognition that the truth is often more systemic and more disturbing than any conspiracy. What emerges is not a portrait of individual evil, but rather a diagnosis of institutional failure, a case study in how modern capitalism creates environments where abuse becomes profitable and accountability becomes optional. The question we must confront is not whether Jeffrey Epstein was guilty. That much is beyond dispute. The question is, what does it mean for our economic system that his guilt was irrelevant to the institutions that enabled him? On August 10, 2019, at approximately 6:30 a.m., Jeffrey Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. Within 72 hours, JP Morgan Chase had systematically erased every public mention of his name from their corporate documents. This was not a cover-up in the traditional sense, but rather a calculated operation in damage control, executed with the precision of a military withdrawal. The question that financial analysts failed to ask was not whether Epstein was guilty, but rather, how much does institutional silence cost when measured in market capitalization losses? To understand why his death mattered economically, we must first understand what Epstein actually sold, and it was not what most people assume. Jeffrey Epstein's hedge fund, Southern Trust Company, had a peculiar characteristic that should have raised immediate red flags in any legitimate financial system. It appeared to have only one visible client, Leslie Wexner, the founder of L Brands. This mathematical impossibility, a single client hedge fund generating billions in alleged returns, was not a minor administrative anomaly, but rather the foundation of an entirely different business model. Epstein did not manage money in the conventional sense. He managed something far more valuable in elite circles. He managed secrets, access, and the architecture of mutual dependency. His actual product was not investment returns, but rather isolation from accountability, packaged as discretion and sold to individuals who could not trust formal institutions with their most sensitive transactions. The economics of compromat, the Russian term for compromising material, function on a simple principle. Information that can destroy a reputation has quantifiable value, and that value increases exponentially when the target occupies positions of power. Epstein understood this principle better than perhaps anyone in modern American finance. Documented transfers between his fund and offshore accounts in tax havens reveal a pattern that defies traditional wealth management. Logic. His properties, scattered across multiple jurisdictions from New York to the Caribbean, functioned not as real estate investments but as economic special zones, territories where normal legal oversight simply did not apply. If we were to diagram Epstein's actual financial products using Bloomberg terminal logic, we would see three core offerings: access to elite networks, jurisdictional isolation from prosecution, and academic legitimation through strategic philanthropy. These were not investment vehicles in any traditional sense. They were insurance policies against accountability. The question then becomes, if Epstein sold access and discretion, who were the institutional buyers? And more critically, what exactly were they purchasing? JP Morgan Chase maintained Jeffrey Epstein's accounts for 15 years after his first conviction for soliciting prostitution from a minor in 2008, finally severing the relationship. Only in 2013, this was not an oversight, it was not a failure of due diligence, it was a deliberate business decision based on a cost-benefit analysis that placed the value of Epstein's network above the reputational risk of association with a convicted sex offender. The numbers tell a story that no amount of corporate public relations can obscure. Between 2002 and 2016, while Epstein was an active client, JP Morgan filed only 7 suspicious activity reports totaling $4.3 million. After his death in 2019, when legal pressure made silence untenable, the bank retroactively filed reports covering $1.3 billion in transactions, approximately 5,000 separate transfers that had been processed without question. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology Media Lab accepted $7.5 million in donations channeled through Epstein, effectively allowing a convicted criminal to purchase influence over research in artificial intelligence and emerging technologies. Harvard University provided him with $6.5 million in funding and, remarkably, an office on campus for a man with no academic credentials whatsoever. When JP Morgan finally closed his accounts, Deutsche Bank immediately accepted him as a client, demonstrating that the issue was not moral standards within individual institutions, but rather a systemic tolerance for profitable toxicity across the entire financial sector. The pattern becomes clear when we examine the corporate connections. Bill Gates, Leon Black of Apollo Global Management, Glenn Dubin of Highbridge Capital Management. These were not accidental associations, they were transactional relationships where the value of Epstein's connections demonstrably exceeded the calculated risk of exposure. An actuarial table, the kind insurance companies use to assess risk and price policies, would show a simple calculation: the value of client Epstein versus the potential cost of public exposure. Until 2019, that calculation consistently favored maintaining the relationship. These institutions did not ignore warning signs. They processed them and determined they were acceptable. The question we must confront is uncomfortable. Why did organizations with sophisticated risk management systems consistently make this choice? In 2008, Alexander Acosta, then United States Attorney for the Southern District of Florida and later Secretary of Labor under President Trump, granted Jeffrey Epstein the most lenient non-prosecution agreement in the documented history of federal sex crime cases. Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 state prostitution charges, served 13 months in a county jail with work release privileges that allowed him to leave custody 12 hours per day, 6 days per week. Acosta would later tell the Trump transition team, according to his own account, that he had been instructed to back off because Epstein belonged to intelligence and was above his pay grade. Whether this claim was true or merely a convenient excuse, it reveals the mechanism by which power converts criminal liability into administrative inconvenience. The mechanism operates through a 3-step process. First, strategic philanthropic donations create dependencies within institutions that might otherwise pursue prosecution. Second, elite social connections ensure that decision makers face career consequences for aggressive enforcement. Third, legal settlements with non-disclosure agreements convert abuse into economic transactions, transferring the cost of impunity from perpetrators to victims. The financial architecture of this system is brutally efficient. Victims received an estimated $121 million in settlements as of 2022, each payment accompanied by legal agreements that prevented them from speaking publicly about their experiences. JP Morgan paid $290 million in regulatory fines related to the Epstein relationship, a figure that represented approximately 2% of a single quarter's profits for the bank. When the cost of impunity is lower than the benefit of association, when fines are rounding errors in quarterly earnings reports, the question is not whether institutions will comply with ethical standards, but rather why they would bother to do so at all. The settlements were not justice, they were cost externalization. The legal system transferred the burden of Epstein's crimes onto his victims through payments that required their silence, while institutions treated the scandal as simply another cost of doing business. The problem of regulatory capture explains much of what enabled Epstein's decades of operation. The institutions responsible for oversight are populated by individuals who rotate between regulatory agencies and the very organizations they are meant to supervise. This creates what economists call a principal-agent problem, where the supposed monitors have stronger incentives to protect future employers than to enforce rules against them. We have seen this pattern before, in cases that might appear unrelated but share identical structural dynamics. Harvey Weinstein in Hollywood, Larry Nassar in competitive gymnastics, systematic abuse within the Catholic Church hierarchy. In each case, a predator accumulated institutional power, victims reported to authorities, institutions performed cost-benefit analyses, and institutions chose to protect the asset rather than the victims. The system perpetuates itself until media exposure makes silence more expensive than accountability, at which point institutions express shock and claim they were unaware of information that their own records proved they possessed. The principle at work here is what we might call too connected to prosecute, a variation on the financial crisis concept of too big to fail. Certain individuals occupy positions within elite networks where prosecution would trigger cascading consequences across multiple institutions, creating an informal immunity based not on law but on systemic fragility. The direct, measurable costs of the Epstein case are substantial but ultimately manageable within the scale of modern finance. Approximately $150 million in legal settlements, $500 million in regulatory fines to banks, $200 million in litigation costs, totaling roughly $850 million in documented expenses. The indirect costs, however, operate on a different scale entirely. Post-Epstein surveys showed measurable declines in public trust in private banking, Ivy League institutions, and billionaire philanthropy. Capital began flowing toward alternative structures, cryptocurrencies, and decentralized finance platforms that explicitly reject trusted intermediaries. As a design principle, institutions now pay significantly higher costs for background verification, compliance systems, and reputational risk insurance, creating what amounts to an invisible tax on the entire financial sector. But the largest cost remains fundamentally unquantifiable: the loss of legitimacy itself. If the winners of the capitalist system achieve their positions through organized crime, if the institutions presented as meritocratic gatekeepers are actually vehicles for elite impunity, then what validates the system's claim to fairness or efficiency? This is not an abstract philosophical question. It is a practical economic problem that manifests in capital flight, institutional avoidance, and the persistent search for alternative systems that do not require trust in compromised intermediaries. The Epstein case matters not because a criminal was caught. It matters because the case revealed that the system was never designed to catch criminals with sufficient social capital. This creates a permanent discount on institutional credibility, a cost that compounds across every subsequent scandal. The paradox of captured institutions is structural. Anyone with sufficient power to reform the system achieved that power by succeeding within the corrupt system. The reformer's dilemma makes genuine change nearly impossible without external forcing mechanisms. Regulators face an equally impossible choice. Punishing Epstein's enablers severely requires admitting that trusted institutions were complicit, which risks destroying the confidence necessary for financial markets to function. The regulatory response has therefore been calibrated to appear serious while avoiding systemic disruption, a performance of accountability rather than its substance. The coordination trap ensures that no individual institution can reform itself without competitive disadvantage. If JP Morgan implements stringent screening that rejects wealthy clients with questionable backgrounds, but Deutsche Bank does not, then Deutsche Bank captures the market share and JP Morgan loses revenue. In a competitive environment, ethical standards become handicaps unless they are universally enforced. Since Epstein's death, there have been zero significant legislative reforms in wealth management regulation. The corporate lessons learned reports are primarily public relations documents with no binding operational changes. The system tolerates figures like Epstein because dismantling the mechanisms that enable them would require dismantling the fundamental architecture of elite capitalism itself, the conversion of financial capital into social capital and back again. Game theory simulations demonstrate why cooperation in compliance is impossible under competitive conditions. The first mover towards stricter standards loses market position, while the last mover gains competitive advantage. This creates a race to the bottom in oversight, where the rational choice for any individual institution is to maintain minimal compliance that satisfies regulators while maximizing profitable relationships. The Epstein case destroyed a comfortable illusion, the idea that markets self-regulate, that elite institutions operate as meritocracies, that wealth correlates with competence rather than access to systems of impunity.